Hey guys, tonight we're talking about medieval queens, the kind history loves to describe as evil. Usually right after they stopped being quiet, stopped smiling politely, and started treating crowns less like jewelry and more like weapons. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Isabella of France did not look like the sort of person who would overthrow a king, which historically speaking is exactly the kind of person who ends up overthrowing a king. She arrived in England, a teenage French princess, elegant, politically valuable, and very much under the impression that her marriage to Edward II would involve ruling, respect, and possibly being acknowledged in public. Instead, she discovered that her husband preferred the company of favorites, ignored his nobles, neglected his queen, and somehow managed to offend the entire political class while acting surprised by the consequences. Edward wasn't cruel in a dramatic way, he was worse, he was embarrassing. Isabella was sidelined, publicly humiliated, and repeatedly reminded that she was decorative, not decisive. So she did what any intelligent medieval queen did when ignored. She stopped arguing and started watching. She noted who was angry, who felt insulted, who had been pushed aside. She listened quietly, while Edward generously alienated everyone with influence. Think of it less as plotting and more as extremely patient note-taking. While Edward burned bridges like it was a personal hobby, Isabella collected allies the way nobles collect grudges. No speeches, no tantrums, just letters, favors, and the general implication that things could be different. Chroniclers later called her cold, which is medieval shorthand for she didn't panic. The moment came when Isabella traveled to France on diplomatic business and simply didn't go back. Instead, she allied with Roger Mortimer, gathered military support, and prepared an invasion of England. This wasn't dramatic. There were no heroic last stands. Edward's support evaporated faster than his credibility. Nobles defected. Cities opened their gates. The king fled like a man suddenly realizing consequences exist. Edward was captured, deposed, and imprisoned. Isabella ruled through her young son Edward III while Mortimer enforced order. Officially, she was regent. Unofficially, she was running the country while everyone pretended this was temporary. Edward's death followed soon after. The records are vague. The rumors are creative. History remains politely unclear. What matters is that the problem removed itself. Isabella was later labeled the she-wolf of France, meant as an insult. But wolves don't rule by screaming, they rule by waiting. Isabella didn't shout. She didn't rush. She let Edward destroy himself, then stepped neatly into the space he left behind, which is not evil. It's just very medieval. Margaret of Anjou did not plan on becoming England's primary problem. She married Henry V expecting to be queen, not chief executive of a collapsing kingdom. Unfortunately for everyone involved, her husband came with two major issues. He was deeply pious, spectacularly indecisive, and periodically checked out of reality altogether, which meant someone had to run the country. Margaret stepped in permanently. Henry's mental breakdowns left power lying around unattended, and medieval politics never wasted unattended power. Margaret didn't panic. She didn't wait. She didn't ask politely. She took control of the court, sidelined rivals, and began treating England like a chessboard where most pieces were expendable. Her primary goal was simple: secure the throne for her son. And if that meant starting a multi-dead civil war that would shred England's nobility like old parchment, so be it. The Wars of the Roses weren't a tragic accident. They were the natural outcome of Margaret refusing to let anyone push her aside. Unlike Isabella of France, Margaret didn't rule quietly. She ruled loudly, decisively, and with a sword always nearby. She raised armies, ordered executions, and removed enemies with a speed that alarmed even hardened nobles. Anyone who questioned her authority quickly learned that mercy was not part of her leadership style. Loyalty was optional, obedience was not. She earned a reputation for cruelty, mostly because she didn't bother hiding the consequences of defiance. While male rulers executed rivals and called it justice, Margaret did the same and was labeled monstrous. Chroniclers described her as ruthless, unnatural, and dangerously ambitious, which in medieval language meant a woman doing things without apologizing. Her enemies painted her as bloodthirsty. Her supporters saw her as the only adult in the room. Either way, she terrified the English nobility, which was impressive considering they spent their free time inventing new ways to betray each other. Margaret's downfall came not from incompetence, but from exhaustion. Decades of war hollowed out the kingdom. Allies turned, fortune shifted. Eventually, her cause collapsed. Her son was killed and she was exiled, alive, but defeated. History often frames her as a villain who plunged England into chaos. But chaos was already there. Margaret simply grabbed it by the throat and tried to aim it. She wasn't subtle. She wasn't gentle. She didn't wait for permission. And in medieval politics, that alone was enough to make you unforgettable and unforgivable. Bruna of Australia ruled for so long that medieval chroniclers eventually stopped being shocked and started being tired. She didn't flash onto the political stage in a dramatic moment. She stayed there for decades, long enough that entire generations of nobles grew up knowing one simple truth. If Brunhilde didn't like you, your career and possibly your head had an expiration date. She began as a Visigothic princess married into the Frankish royal family, which immediately placed her inside one of Europe's most violent soap operas. Frankish politics were not subtle. Kings were assassinated, brothers murdered brothers, and nephews disappeared with impressive regularity. Brunhilde looked at this environment and thought, "Fine, I can work with this." When her husband was murdered, Brunhilde didn't retreat into mourning. She leaned forward hard. She ruled as regent, manipulated courts, removed rivals through legal executions, and treated the law like a weapon with excellent paperwork. Everything was technically official, which somehow made it worse. Her greatest talent was persistence. Brunhilde outlived rivals, crushed rebellions, and returned to power again and again after being exiled, imprisoned, or sidelined. Each time she came back, she was angrier, more efficient, and noticeably less interested in forgiveness. If medieval politics rewarded grudges, Brunhilde would have been unstoppable. And then there was Fredegund, her rival, enemy, and personal nightmare. Their feud wasn't political, it was generational, violent, and fueled by mutual hatred. Assassinations, poisonings, and purges followed in a cycle so relentless that even medieval chroniclers paused to say, "All right, this is getting excessive." Bruna ruled with authority that terrified the nobility. She enforced laws, punished corruption, and refused to be decorative. And like many powerful women of the era, her competence became the crime. Chroniclers accused her of cruelty, ambition, and moral corruption. Accusations conveniently leveled as she executed the men writing them. Her downfall came late in life, very late. Captured by her enemies, she was put on trial in a spectacle designed not to judge, but to erase. The punishment was deliberately brutal, tied to a horse and dragged to death. Medieval justice had a flair for drama. History remembered her as monstrous, but monsters don't rule for decades. Bruna didn't survive because she was cruel. She survived because she understood one rule perfectly. In medieval politics, mercy is optional, memory is fatal. If Brunhilde ruled through endurance, Fredegund ruled through fear. She did not climb the social ladder politely. She grabbed it, shook it violently, and removed anyone standing above her. Fredegund began life as a servant in the Frankish court, which meant she learned early how power really worked, who whispered, who listened, and who mysteriously vanished after dinner. She became the mistress of King Chilperic I, then allegedly helped arrange the death of his queen. Shortly afterward, she became the new queen. This was not subtle. This was career advancement with casualties. Fredegund understood one essential truth of medieval politics: people obeyed faster when they were scared. While Bruna favored laws, trials, and long-term revenge, Fredegund preferred immediate solutions. If someone opposed her, they didn't receive a warning, they received a problem. Sometimes poisoned, sometimes stabbed, occasionally removed in ways so creative that chroniclers stopped pretending to be shocked. Assassination was not a last resort for Fredegund, it was a scheduling tool. Her rivalry with Brunhilde turned Frankish politics into a generational blood feud. Each side blamed the other for murders, rebellions, and collapsing alliances. And the worst part, they were both correct. Fredegund arranged the deaths of rivals, bishops, and even members of the royal family with the calm efficiency of someone organizing household chores. She was particularly fond of plausible deniability. Murders happened at night. Accidents occurred conveniently, blades slipped. Poison daggers found their way into hands that had no business holding them. Fredegund never needed to be present. Her reputation did the work for her. Despite all this, she ruled successfully. She defended her son's claim to the throne, crushed rebellions, and maintained power in a court where survival itself was an achievement. Nobles obeyed her not out of loyalty, but out of the very reasonable desire to remain alive. Chroniclers hated her. They described her as cruel, unnatural, and morally corrupt, which in medieval writing usually meant she frightened men who preferred women to be quiet. They emphasized her background as a servant, as if ambition itself were a crime. Fredegund died peacefully in bed, which, considering her resume, feels deeply unfair. She didn't rule by patience. She didn't rule by law. She ruled by making the cost of opposition unbearably high. And in a world where survival depended on decisiveness, Fredegund didn't hesitate ever. Eleanor of Aquitaine was not officially labeled evil. She was labeled terrifyingly competent, which in medieval politics was basically the same thing, but with better handwriting. Eleanor inherited Aquitaine, one of the richest territories in Europe, which immediately made her the most valuable woman on the continent. She married the King of France, went on crusade, decided she didn't like him, annulled the marriage, and promptly married the future King of England. This was not romance, this was geopolitical speed running. As Queen of England, Eleanor discovered that her husband Henry II was ambitious, controlling, and deeply allergic to sharing power. So, she did what any reasonable medieval queen would do. She encouraged their sons to rebel against him. Family bonding, but make it civil war. The result was the Great Revolt, a spectacular family argument that involved armies, betrayals, and Henry chasing his own children across Europe. Eleanor was captured and imprisoned for 16 years, which sounds harsh until you remember that most medieval prisons did not come with estates, servants, and correspondence privileges. She was grounded but in a royal way. Even in captivity, Eleanor remained influential. She wrote letters, arranged marriages, managed estates, and waited. When Henry died, she emerged from prison like someone who had simply been on a very long vacation with poor reviews. She ruled as regent for her son, Richard the Lionheart, handled diplomacy, and negotiated ransoms when Richard was captured. Basically, she cleaned up after her sons while pretending not to judge them. Eleanor's true scheme wasn't assassination or coups, it was dynastic engineering. She married her children into nearly every major European royal house, ensuring that future centuries of politics would be haunted by her descendants. If medieval Europe was a family drama, Eleanor was the producer. Chroniclers often accused her of ambition, pride, and meddling. They did not accuse her of incompetence. Even her enemies admitted she was brilliant, which is the medieval equivalent of admitting defeat in slow motion. She outlived most of her rivals, most of her children, and several kings. By the end of her life, she had shaped kingdoms, launched rebellions, survived imprisonment, and turned marriage into a weapon of mass political influence. Eleanor didn't poison anyone. She didn't order public executions. She simply rearranged Europe so thoroughly that everyone else spent centuries dealing with the consequences, which is arguably the most elegant scheme on this list. Blanche of Castile didn't need poison, daggers, or midnight assassins. She ruled France with something far more frightening: paperwork, conviction, and the absolute confidence that she was correct. When her husband Louis VII died, Blanche became regent for their young son Louis IX. This immediately upset the French nobility, who believed that a woman running the kingdom was a temporary inconvenience at best and an insult at worst. Blanche responded by doing the one thing they didn't expect: she governed exceptionally well. Rebellions broke out almost immediately because medieval nobles treated regencies like free trial periods for chaos. Blanche crushed them calmly, methodically, with an energy that suggested she had already planned for this, and was mildly annoyed she had to waste her afternoon on it. She negotiated alliances, raised armies, secured borders, and made it very clear that France would not be torn apart just because some men felt nostalgic for civil war. When nobles tried to undermine her authority, she reminded them politely, firmly, that the crown was not a suggestion. It was a command. Blanche also understood optics. She wrapped her authority in religion, presenting herself as God's chosen guardian of the realm and of her son. Opposing her wasn't just treason, it was borderline heresy. Medieval nobles loved arguing, but arguing with God's representative required more courage than most of them possessed. Her critics accused her of cruelty, arrogance, and manipulation. Blanche called it governance. When rebels were defeated, she confiscated lands, punished leaders, and removed threats permanently. No grand speeches, no apologies, just consequences. She was fiercely protective of her son's authority to the point that even after Louis reached adulthood, she continued to influence policy. Some chroniclers whispered that she controlled him too tightly. Blanche would likely have replied that France still existed, and that was the point. Unlike many queens in this list, Blanche died respected, which is rare for women who actually exercised power. But even that respect came with discomfort. Chroniclers couldn't decide whether to praise her or warn future generations about her. She didn't rule through fear alone, she ruled through certainty. And certainty in a medieval court full of ambition and incompetence was terrifying. Blanche of Castile didn't scheme in shadows. She stood in the open and dared anyone to challenge her. Very few did. Hannah of Castile is remembered by one nickname and one nickname only: Laoka, Hannah the Mad, which is extremely convenient when everyone around you is trying to take your throne. Hannah was the legitimate queen of Castile, not queen in theory, not queen someday. She was the rightful ruler, crowned and recognized. The problem was that she stood in the way of three very ambitious men: her father, her husband, and later her son. Medieval Europe had a solution for women who were inconveniently legitimate: declare them unstable and lock them away. Hannah married Philip the Handsome, a man who lived up to his name and very little else. He openly cheated, ignored her authority, and attempted to rule Castile in her name while quietly removing her from actual decision-making. When Hannah reacted emotionally, angry, jealous, upset, this was recorded not as a reasonable response, but as evidence. Medieval diagnosis was simple: if a woman protested loudly, something must be wrong with her mind. Then Philip died suddenly, very suddenly, possibly of illness, possibly of poison. Medieval sources are delightfully vague. When powerful men die at inconvenient moments, Juana was devastated. Publicly grieving your husband, however, was also suspicious, especially when that husband's death made you queen without interference. Hannah's father, Ferdinand, stepped in to help. He declared his daughter unfit to rule and confine her. After his death, her son Charles did the same thing. By this point, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Hannah remained queen in name only for decades while men ruled around her through her, and because of her removal, was Hannah mentally ill? Possibly. Was she politically inconvenient? Absolutely. And medieval courts had far more experience dealing with inconvenience than compassion. She spent much of her life imprisoned, isolated, and erased from power while official documents continued to bear her name. The kingdom functioned perfectly well without her, which is often cited as proof she was unfit rather than proof she had been successfully sidelined. Hannah didn't scheme with daggers or armies. Her evil was accidental. Her existence disrupted the plans of powerful men, and for that, she was neutralized with whispers, labels, and locked doors. In medieval politics, madness wasn't always diagnosed. Sometimes it was assigned, and once assigned, it was permanent. Millicent of Jerusalem ruled one of the most unstable kingdoms on earth and somehow made it look like an administrative task, which is impressive considering the kingdom of Jerusalem was surrounded by enemies, filled with ambitious crusaders, and constantly one bad decision away from collapsing into dust and religious arguments. Millicent inherited the throne legally, publicly, and without apology. This immediately caused problems because many of the men around her believed ruling a crusader state required constant sword-waving and loud prayers, not careful governance by a woman who understood politics better than they understood geography. Her husband Fulk of Anjou tried to sideline her. This went poorly for him. Millicent calmly rallied nobles, isolated him politically, and turned the court against his authority. There was no public showdown, no dramatic rebellion. Folk simply woke up one day to discover he had become a decorative king with excellent armor and no real power. Millicent governed with restraint, intelligence, and an alarming ability to survive betrayal. She balanced crusader factions, negotiated alliances, and kept Jerusalem functioning while surrounded by people who thought impulsive heroics were a substitute for policy. She ruled because she understood that stability, not enthusiasm, keeps a kingdom alive. The real test came when her own son decided he wanted the throne early. Baldwin III attempted to push her aside, expecting support from nobles tired of maternal oversight. Millicent responded the medieval way. She raised troops, took cities, and reminded everyone that legitimacy mattered more than impatience. Her son learned a valuable lesson about succession, mainly that asking nicely works better than rebellion. Even after stepping back from direct rule, Millicent retained influence. Nobles still sought her approval. Policy still bore her mark. She wasn't removed. She simply adjusted her position, which is far more dangerous than being defeated outright. Chroniclers described her as proud, stubborn, and overly authoritative, which is medieval shorthand for she refused to disappear. She didn't massacre rivals. She didn't poison opponents. She simply ruled competently in a place where incompetence usually got everyone killed. Millicent's evil wasn't cruelty, it was control. And in a crusader kingdom built on chaos, control was the most threatening force of all. Araka of Lion ruled in a way best described as constant damage control. Not because she was incompetent, but because her kingdom seemed personally offended by the idea of being governed peacefully. Civil war, betrayal, shifting alliances, and deeply inconvenient husbands followed her everywhere. Like medieval emotional support disasters, she inherited the throne of Lion and Castile outright, legally, publicly, and without ambiguity. Naturally, everyone panicked. Powerful nobles were uncomfortable with a woman ruling alone. So, the solution was obvious. Marry her off immediately and hope the problem solved itself. Urca married Alfonso I of Aragon, a man with a sword, an ego, and absolutely no interest in being a co-ruler. The marriage collapsed almost instantly. Alonso tried to rule over Araka rather than with her, sidelining her authority, and treating her kingdom as a convenient expansion pack. Araka responded the medieval way. She declared the marriage invalid, raised armies, and plunged the peninsula into civil war. Romance was officially cancelled. What followed was years of chaos. Nobles switched sides, cities rebelled, armies marched, retreated, and occasionally forgot who they were supposed to be fighting. Araka navigated this mess with relentless determination and very little sentimentality. She made alliances with former enemies, abandoned them when necessary, and survived more uprisings than most kings managed in a lifetime. Chroniclers despised her. They accused her of promiscuity, arrogance, and moral decay. Accusations that conveniently intensified whenever she refused to obey male authority. Meanwhile, the men around her launched rebellions, broke oaths, and destabilized the realm without receiving half the criticism. Medieval double standards were nothing if not consistent. Despite constant warfare, Uruk remained queen. That alone was an achievement. She was not overthrown. She was not erased. She ruled until her death, maintaining authority through sheer refusal to disappear. The kingdom didn't flourish, but it didn't fall apart either, which given the circumstances counts as success. Uruk's reign wasn't elegant, it wasn't orderly, it was stubborn. Her evil wasn't cruelty or manipulation, it was endurance. She refused to step aside, refused to surrender legitimacy, and refused to let anyone else wear her crown comfortably. In medieval politics, surviving chaos was sometimes the most radical act of power there was. Constance of Sicily terrified medieval Europe in the quietest possible way. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She didn't dramatically order heads to roll. She simply showed up with a legitimate claim, a functioning brain, and the unsettling ability to remember exactly who owed her what. Constance was born into the Norman royal family of Sicily and for a long time was treated as politically harmless. She was unmarried well into adulthood, which medieval observers interpreted as either a failure or a blessing. It was neither. It was a delay. When she finally married the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, her value became immediately obvious and extremely inconvenient for everyone who preferred Sicily fragmented and weak. When Henry died, Constance didn't panic. She didn't cling to regency councils or beg for approval. She ruled Sicily directly, securing the throne for her son, Frederick II, with relentless efficiency. Nobles who expected a ceremonial queen discovered that Constance had opinions, memory, and zero tolerance for nonsense. Her governing style was cold, legal, and devastating. She stripped rebellious nobles of land, dismantled local power bases, and replaced chaos with order. The worst possible outcome for aristocrats who thrived on confusion. Everything she did was technically lawful, which meant no one could accuse her of tyranny without sounding like they disliked the law itself. Constance also understood optics. She presented herself as calm, restrained, and almost boring. This was strategic. Medieval courts were full of loud personalities eager to overplay their hand. Constance let them. While they argued, she issued decrees. She didn't execute rivals publicly. She didn't need to. She neutralized them through administrative isolation, legal exclusion, and the slow suffocation of privilege. If you woke up one morning and discovered you were no longer important, that was Constance's doing. Chroniclers struggled with her. She wasn't scandalous enough to demonize properly. She didn't fit the narrative of the hysterical woman or the bloodthirsty queen. Instead, they accused her of being cold, distant, and overly controlling medieval code for we couldn't manipulate her. Her greatest scheme wasn't cruelty, it was continuity. By securing Sicily intact for her son, Constance ensured that Frederick II would inherit one of the most powerful realms in Europe. The consequences of her rule echoed for decades long after she was gone. Constance didn't leave chaos behind, she left structure. And in medieval politics, structure was often more dangerous than violence. Adela of Normandy didn't rule a kingdom, which made her far more dangerous than many people who did. She ruled something medieval nobles took very seriously: land, money, and the future careers of their children. And she did it quietly, efficiently, and without ever needing a crown. Adela was the daughter of William the Conqueror, which meant ambition came standard. She married Stephen of Blahir, a man who went off on crusade with enthusiasm and never quite managed to come back in one piece. When he died abroad, Adela did not faint, panic, or retreat into widowhood. She stepped directly into power and ran Blahir herself, and she ran it well. While many male rulers treated governance like a hobby they picked up between wars, Adela treated it like a full-time occupation. She administered justice, managed finances, negotiated with church authorities, and made sure her lands remained stable, while neighboring regions enjoyed their usual medieval chaos. Nobles who expected a decorative widow discovered that Adela remembered names, slights, and unpaid obligations with alarming accuracy. Her greatest long-term scheme was dynastic. Adela carefully positioned her sons for power, pushing one toward the church and another toward kingship. She didn't just raise children, she engineered futures. One of her sons eventually became King Stephen of England, which meant Adela successfully upgraded her family's status without ever setting foot on a battlefield. She also maintained close correspondence with church leaders, including bishops and abbots, shaping religious politics in her favor. This wasn't piety, this was strategy. The church remembered favors, and Adela was very good at making herself unforgettable. Chroniclers described her as strong-willed, sharp-tongued, and excessively involved in governance, which is medieval shorthand for she did not stay quiet. They did not accuse her of cruelty because cruelty required spectacle. Adela preferred leverage. Her rule didn't collapse. Her lands didn't revolt. Her authority didn't dissolve the moment she stepped away. That kind of stability required planning, discipline, and a complete lack of interest in being liked. Adela's evil wasn't bloodshed, it was control without drama. She didn't overthrow kings, she produced one. And in medieval Europe, that was one of the most effective schemes imaginable. Matilda of Tuscany didn't scheme quietly. She didn't whisper behind curtains or wait for permission. She openly challenged emperors repeatedly and somehow lived long enough to do it again. In medieval Europe, this was considered poor manners. Matilda controlled vast territories in northern Italy at a time when the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope were locked in a furious power struggle known as the investiture controversy. Most rulers tried to stay neutral. Matilda picked a side, grabbed a sword, and funded half the war. She backed the papacy with troops, money, castles, and a level of commitment that suggested she took political grudges very personally. Emperors hated her deeply, publicly, persistently. Henry IV attempted to crush her power more than once, only to discover that Matilda was extremely difficult to remove. She raised armies, defended fortresses, and understood the terrain better than anyone foolish enough to invade her lands. When Henry famously stood barefoot in the snow at Cosa, begging the Pope for forgiveness, he did so at Matilda's castle. Hosting an emperor's humiliation was not an accident, it was hospitality with a message. Matilda didn't just fight wars, she outlasted them. She lost battles, regrouped, returned, and kept going. Each time imperial forces thought they had finally broken her power, she reappeared with another army and another legal claim. Nobles learned that siding against her meant a long, exhausting career. In regret, chroniclers struggled with Matilda. She didn't fit the usual categories. She was devout but violent, noble but relentless, female but commanding armies without apology. So they described her as overly masculine, excessively stubborn, and dangerously influential. Medieval code for she kept winning. Her greatest scheme came at the end of her life. Matilda bequeathed her vast lands to the papacy, ensuring that emperors would continue fighting over her territory long after she was gone. Even in death, she refused to make things easy. Matilda's evil wasn't cruelty. It was defiance. She didn't bend. She didn't retreat. She didn't accept the limits placed on her authority. And in a medieval world built on obedience, that made her one of the most disruptive figures of her age. Sword, castle, and all. Anne of Kiev arrived in France carrying something far more dangerous than ambition or armies: literacy. In a medieval court, where many nobles treated reading an optional hobby, and could read, write, and sign documents, which immediately made her suspicious. She came from Kiev and Ruse, married to King Henry I of France, and stepped into a court that was deeply unprepared for a queen who understood paperwork, while Henry ruled, and quietly co-signed royal charters, advised on governance, and left her unmistakable mark on official documents. Her signature survives. Many of the men around her could barely manage an X. This alone made her threatening. After Henry's death, and served as regent for her young son, Philip I, and this is where chroniclers start to get uncomfortable, and didn't fade into the background. She didn't hand over power and retire gracefully. She stayed involved, actively involved, shaping policy, managing alliances, and continuing to sign documents like someone who knew exactly what they were worth. Naturally, this annoyed people, and later remarried, choosing a powerful noble without royal approval. This was framed as scandalous, inappropriate, and borderline treasonous. But the real issue wasn't romance, it was independence. By remarrying on her own terms, and demonstrated that she did not require permission to make life-altering decisions, medieval courts did not enjoy that energy. Chroniclers responded by slowly erasing her. Later records downplayed her influence, questioned her judgment, and emphasized her foreign origins as if literacy itself had crossed the border illegally. Over time, and faded from popular memory, reduced to a footnote instead of the active ruler she had been. Her scheme wasn't assassination, it wasn't rebellion, it was competence, and ruled by knowing things, by understanding documents, by remembering details others ignored. She influenced France not through spectacle, but through presence, steady, informed, and inconvenient. In a world where authority was often inherited blindly, and represented something dangerous, a ruler who actually understood what she was signing. Her evil was subtle, she made ignorance visible, and medieval power structures do not like being embarrassed, especially by a woman from the East who knew how to spell her own name. Catherine of Valois didn't look dangerous, that was the entire problem. She arrived in England as the young French bride of Henry V, the warrior king, the hero of a court, the man who collected victories the way medieval kings collected enemies. Catherine's job officially was simple: produce an heir and look appropriately royal while doing it. Unofficially, her existence was a diplomatic bandage slapped onto a very bloody war. Then Henry died very inconveniently and very quickly. Catherine was left a widow in her early 20s with a baby son, Henry V, who was immediately crowned king. This should have made Catherine powerful. Instead, it made her dangerous to everyone else. A young queen mother with influence, wealth, and marriage potential was a political hazard. So the English government did what it always did when faced with an inconvenient woman: it restricted her. Parliament passed laws limiting Catherine's right to remarry without royal approval. This wasn't about morality, it was about control. Whoever married Catherine would gain access to the king, the court, and potentially the throne. England did not want surprises. So, Catherine waited quietly, and then she did exactly what no one expected. She married anyway, secretly, to Untitled, a Welsh courtier of no great status, no great wealth, and absolutely no business marrying the Dowager Queen of England. It was not a political power move, which somehow made it worse because that marriage produced children, and those children produced a dynasty. Catherine's descendants became the Tudor, Henry VII, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, a line that reshaped England permanently. Her minor unofficial marriage triggered the end of the medieval world and the beginning of the early modern one, which is a disproportionate outcome for what was supposed to be a footnote. Chroniclers tried to minimize her role. They described her as naive, romantic, or careless. This was comforting. It suggested history was accidental. It wasn't. Catherine didn't overthrow kings. She didn't order executions. She didn't command armies. She simply married without permission and let time do the rest. And in medieval politics, nothing was more dangerous than a quiet decision whose consequences no one noticed until it was far too late. Agnes of Pu didn't lose power because she was cruel, stupid, or ineffective. She lost power because medieval politics had decided she was finished. and once that decision is made, reality tends to follow along obediently. Agnes became regent of the Holy Roman Empire after the death of her husband, Henry III, ruling on behalf of her young son, Henry IV. On paper, this was normal. In practice, it was intolerable. The empire was vast, unstable, and filled with men who believed a woman ruling it was a temporary clerical error. Agnes governed cautiously, too cautiously. According to her critics, she relied on advisors, tried to balance powerful factions, and avoided unnecessary bloodshed. This would have been praised in a male regent. In Agnes, it was interpreted as weakness. Medieval courts had a fascinating habit of calling restraint failure only when women practiced it. Her greatest mistake was trust. Agnes believed alliances meant something. She believed nobles would honor agreements. She believed bishops were loyal. These were not rookie errors, they were philosophical ones. Medieval power did not reward good faith. The turning point came with the coup of Kaisers when rival nobles abducted her son, effectively removing Agnes from power while claiming they were protecting the empire, which is medieval code for "we're done listening to you." Agnes was sidelined not by rebellion, but by paperwork, excuses, and very confident men insisting this was for everyone's benefit. After losing control, Agnes withdrew from politics and entered religious life. Chroniclers praised this as humility and repentance. Conveniently, it also ensured she would never claim authority. Her reputation was slowly rewritten: indecisive, weak, overly emotional. The standard post-removal biography, but Agnes' real crime wasn't incompetence. It was being surrounded by men who wanted her gone. She ruled during an impossible moment with limited options and constant resistance. When she failed, history blamed her. When the men who replaced her caused chaos, history called it necessary conflict. Agnes wasn't evil in the theatrical sense. Her evil was structural. She proved something medieval society didn't want to admit: that even a capable queen could be undone, not by enemies, but by the quiet collective decision to stop obeying her. And that may be the most chilling scheme of all. Empress Irene was born around the year 752 in Athens, a city that by the 8th century was no longer the intellectual powerhouse of antiquity, but still carried cultural prestige. Athens at this time was provincial, Christian, and far from the political heart of the Byzantine world. Irene came from a noble family, respectable, but not influential enough to shape imperial politics on its own. Nothing in her early circumstances suggested she would one day rule an empire. Her rise would come not through inheritance or military glory, but through careful placement, patience, and an extraordinary ability to survive the Byzantine court. As a young woman, Irene was selected to participate in a bride show, a uniquely Byzantine custom in which eligible noble women were evaluated and chosen for imperial marriage. The process was as political as it was personal. Beauty mattered, but so did family background, loyalty, and the absence of dangerous connections. Irene's lack of powerful relatives likely worked in her favor. She posed no threat to the ruling dynasty and could be molded to fit its needs. She was chosen to marry Leo, the son of Emperor Constantine V, and was brought to Constantinople around the age of 17. Her arrival in the capital marked a dramatic transformation. Constantinople was immense, ceremonial, and unforgiving. The palace functioned as both a home and a battlefield, governed by ritual, suspicion, and constant surveillance. Irene entered a world where words were weighed carefully. Alliances shifted overnight, and mistakes could lead to exile, mutilation, or death. As a foreigner from Greece, she would have been watched closely, judged by courtiers eager to test her intelligence and loyalty. In the year 769, Irene married Leo, who would later become Emperor Leo IV. Publicly, she appeared as the ideal imperial wife, pious, reserved, and dutiful. Privately, she began learning the mechanics of power. She observed how decisions were made, how influence flowed through servants, clergy, generals, and family members. Irene also entered an empire divided by deep religious conflict. Leo's family strongly supported iconoclasm, the rejection and destruction of religious images, while Irene quietly leaned toward the iconophile position, favoring their restoration. From the moment she entered the palace, Irene was not merely adapting to imperial life. She was studying it. The court did not shape her character as much as it revealed it. Beneath the surface of a compliant empress consort, Irene was already preparing for a far greater role, one that would eventually place her above husbands, sons, and tradition itself. When Leo IV ascended the throne in the year 775, Irene became empress consort of the Byzantine Empire. The transition from imperial bride to emperor's wife came with new visibility and new danger. Leo ruled an empire still shaped by his father's hard-line policies, especially the enforcement of iconoclasm. Religious images were banned, monasteries were restricted, and opposition clergy were punished. Publicly, Irene conformed. Privately, she observed and waited. Her most important role during these early years was motherhood. In the year 771, Irene gave birth to a son, Constantine. This single event transformed her position at court. As the mother of the heir, Irene's status was no longer ceremonial. She now had a direct stake in the future of the dynasty. Every decision affecting the empire was also a decision affecting her child's inheritance. Protecting Constantine became inseparable from protecting herself. Leo IV was not a strong or confident ruler. Chronic illness plagued him, and his reign was marked more by maintenance than ambition. He attempted to soften his father's iconoclastic legacy without fully abandoning it, a balancing act that pleased no one. Iconoclast hardliners distrusted him, while icon supporters remained depressed. Irene watched these tensions closely. She cultivated a reputation for piety, generosity to churches, and quiet devotion, all while avoiding open confrontation. Behind the scenes, the imperial household became increasingly divided. Leo's family, especially his half-brothers, resented Irene's influence and feared her growing authority as Constantine's mother. Accusations circulated that Irene secretly supported the veneration of icons. Leo himself reportedly discovered religious images hidden among her belongings. The incident did not lead to her downfall, but it confirmed what many already suspected. Irene's beliefs did not align with official policy. Despite this, Irene survived. She understood restraint. Rather than challenging her husband directly, she focused on building networks of loyalty among palace officials, eunuchs, and sympathetic clergy. These relationships would later prove decisive. Her power was not loud or obvious. It was domestic, relational, and carefully concealed. In the year 780, Leo IV died suddenly, leaving behind a 10-year-old heir. In a single moment, the balance of power shifted completely. Constantine was emperor in name, but far too young to rule. Irene stepped forward as regent, assuming authority not as a placeholder, but as a governing force. Her years of observation were over. The period of action had begun. With the death of Leo IV in the year 780, the Byzantine Empire found itself ruled by a child. Constantine VI was only 10 years old, legally emperor, but incapable of exercising real authority. Into this vacuum stepped his mother, Empress Irene, who assumed the role of regent with remarkable speed and confidence. Officially, she governed in her son's name. In reality, she ruled alone. The early months of Irene's regency were tense and dangerous. The Byzantine state had little tolerance for female authority, especially when paired with religious controversy. Many generals and officials believed that a woman could not properly command an empire constantly at war. Others feared that Irene would overturn decades of iconoclastic policy. Rebellions flared almost immediately. Several members of the imperial family attempted to claim power, arguing that male rule was both traditional and necessary. Irene responded decisively. Conspirators were arrested, tonsured, or exiled, removing rivals without creating martyrs. Her most pressing challenge was control of the military. The army was deeply loyal to iconoclasm and suspicious of Irene's known religious sympathies. Rather than confronting them directly, she relied on careful appointments and strategic distance. Key commands were reshuffled, loyal officers promoted, and outspoken opponents quietly sidelined. Irene understood that survival depended on neutralizing threats before they could unite. At the same time, she began preparing for the most ambitious religious reversal in Byzantine history. For decades, the empire had been divided over the use of religious images. Irene believed iconoclasm had fractured the church, weakened imperial legitimacy, and alienated powerful religious communities. Yet restoring icons too quickly could provoke open revolt. She moved slowly, first replacing the iconoclastic patriarch with a more flexible figure, then testing public reaction through controlled gestures of tolerance. Throughout this period, Constantine remained largely in the background. Irene ensured her son received an education appropriate for an emperor, but she tightly controlled his access to power. He attended ceremonies, signed documents, and appeared before the people. Yet decisions never reached him unfiltered. The regency was becoming less temporary with each passing year. By stabilizing the court, suppressing opposition, and carefully reshaping religious policy, Irene transformed herself from guardian to ruler. The empire was no longer merely waiting for a boy to grow into power. It was adjusting to the reality of a woman who had no intention of surrendering control quietly. As regent, Empress Irene now turned to the issue that had quietly shaped her entire political identity: the restoration of religious icons. Iconoclasm had dominated imperial policy for more than half a century. Enforced by law and backed by military power, it had fractured families, emptied monasteries, and turned bishops into political prisoners. Irene believed it had also eroded the moral authority of the emperor. Restoring icons was not only a religious act, it was a calculated attempt to heal the empire and legitimize her rule. She began cautiously. Irene removed outspoken iconoclasts from key church positions and elevated clergy who favored compromise. The most important appointment was the selection of a new patriarch of Constantinople, Tarasius, a lay official loyal to Irene who was willing to guide the church back toward icon veneration without provoking immediate backlash. His appointment alone signaled a shift even before any formal decree was issued. In the year 786, Irene attempted to convene an ecumenical council in Constantinople to officially reverse iconoclasm. The effort nearly collapsed into disaster. Soldiers loyal to iconoclastic doctrine stormed the council chamber, forcing its dissolution. For many rulers, this humiliation would have ended the project. Irene instead treated it as a lesson. The military could not be ignored or rushed. It had to be neutralized first. Over the next year, Irene carefully removed rebellious troops from the capital, dispersing them to distant provinces under new commanders. Only once the threat was contained did she reconvene the council, this time in the city of Nika in the year 787. The gathering, later known as the Second Council of Nika, formally restored the veneration of icons, declaring that images were worthy of honor, not worship. Iconoclasm was condemned as heresy. The decision reshaped the empire. Churches reopened, icons returned to public spaces, and exiled clergy were restored. For icon supporters, Irene became a savior of orthodoxy. For her enemies, she became proof that female rule led to religious chaos. Irene embraced the praise and ignored the resentment. She ordered the council's decisions enforced across the empire, making reversal increasingly difficult. This victory elevated Irene's prestige beyond Constantinople. She was now recognized by the wider Christian world as the ruler who healed a spiritual wound left open for generations. Yet restoring icons also deepened her dependence on personal authority. The empire was bound to her choices, and the future emperor, her son, was grown older. The question was no longer whether Irene could rule, but whether she would ever willingly step aside. By the late 700s, the regency of Empress Irene had stretched far beyond what tradition considered acceptable. Constantine VI was no longer a child. He was approaching adulthood, educated, publicly crowned, and increasingly aware that he ruled only in name. For years, Irene had justified her authority as temporary and necessary. Now, that justification was beginning to erode. Pressure mounted from every direction. Military leaders, already uneasy with female rule, urged Constantine to assert himself. Couriers whispered that the empire needed a man at its head, especially with ongoing conflicts against Bulgars and Arabs. Even supporters of icon veneration began to worry that Irene's continued dominance risked destabilizing the dynasty she claimed to protect. Constantine himself grew resentful. He had been emperor since childhood. Yet every order passed through his mother's hands. In the year 790, Constantine made his first attempt to break free. With support from army factions, he declared himself sole ruler and ordered his mother removed from power. Irene was briefly confined and stripped of authority. For a moment, it appeared that the long regency had ended. Constantine took command, eager to prove himself as a military leader and independent emperor. The results were disappointing. Constantine's campaigns were poorly managed and often unsuccessful. He suffered humiliating defeats, particularly against the Bulgars, which damaged his credibility with the army. His personal life also attracted criticism. His divorce and remarriage angered the church and alienated many of the same clergy who had once supported him against Irene. In a court that valued stability and tradition, Constantine appeared reckless and indecisive. Irene watched and waited. Even in exile, she maintained contacts within the palace. Her allies quietly returned to positions of influence, framing Constantine's failures as proof that the empire was safer under her guidance. Within a few years, sentiment shifted. Constantine, isolated and weakened, was persuaded to recall his mother and restore her to power as co-ruler. This restoration marked a turning point. Irene no longer presented herself as a guardian, stepping aside when her task was complete. She ruled openly alongside her son, issuing decrees in both their names. Yet the balance between them was unequal. Irene commanded loyalty, experience, and religious authority. Constantine commanded little beyond his title. Mother and son now ruled together, but trust between them was gone. What had begun as a temporary regency had evolved into a power struggle that could not end peacefully. The empire stood at a dangerous crossroads, with a dynasty divided against itself. The uneasy partnership between mother and son could not last. By the early 800s, it was clear that the Byzantine Empire could not be governed by divided authority. Empress Irene and Constantine VI shared a throne, but not trust, vision, or loyalty. Each decree carried the weight of rivalry. Each ceremony exposed the tension between a seasoned ruler and a son who felt robbed of his birthright. Constantine attempted once more to assert himself. He dismissed officials loyal to Irene and tried to rebuild support within the army, but his reputation was already damaged. Defeats in battle lingered in memory, and his personal decisions had alienated both clergy and aristocracy. Irene, by contrast, remained associated with religious unity and stability. Her court was calm, where his was chaotic. In Byzantine politics, perception mattered as much as success. Irene moved carefully, but decisively. She began isolating Constantine from sources of support, replacing guards, restricting access, and controlling the flow of information. Palace officials, many of them eunuchs loyal to Irene, ensured that Constantine's orders were delayed or ignored. The emperor found himself increasingly alone within his own residence. In the year 82, the conflict reached its brutal conclusion. Constantine was seized by loyalists of his mother and imprisoned within the palace. What followed shocked even a society accustomed to ruthless power struggles. Constantine was blinded, an act that rendered him unfit to rule under Byzantine law. The blinding was severe and likely fatal. Whether Irene personally ordered the act or merely allowed it remains debated, but responsibility ultimately rested with her. With her son removed, Irene assumed sole power as emperor, not empress, consort, or regent, but ruler in her own name. She adopted the masculine imperial title, signaling that no intermediary stood between her and authority. For the first time in Roman and Byzantine history, a woman ruled the empire alone. The reaction was mixed and intense. Some were horrified by the cruelty inflicted on a son by his own mother. Others justified it as a tragic necessity to preserve stability. Irene herself framed the act as an act of duty, placing the empire above personal bonds. In her mind, Constantine's failures had endangered everything she had built. The blinding marked the point of no return. Irene had crossed the final boundary, separating accepted political maneuvering from moral infamy. Yet she had also achieved what no woman before her had accomplished: absolute power over the Byzantine Empire. With Constantine removed, Empress Irene ruled the Byzantine Empire alone, an unprecedented situation that unsettled nearly every institution of power. She did not present herself as a caretaker or exception. Irene adopted the full authority and titles of an emperor, appearing on coinage and official documents without reference to a male counterpart. In form and function, she was sovereign. Her reign as sole ruler was marked by caution rather than ambition. Irene understood that her position was fragile. Many accepted her authority only reluctantly, viewing her rule as an emergency solution rather than a permanent model. To counter this, she leaned heavily on legitimacy through religion. She emphasized her role as restorer of orthodoxy, patron of monasteries, and protector of the church. Clergy, who benefited from the end of iconoclasm, largely supported her, offering moral justification for her continued rule. Administratively, Irene favored stability over reform. She relied on experienced officials, many of them eunuchs, whose loyalty was personal rather than dynastic. This insulated her from the ambitions of military aristocrats, but also weakened imperial control over the provinces. The army, already skeptical of her authority, grew restless. Campaigns against external enemies were limited, defensive, and often inconclusive. Irene preferred diplomacy and tribute to costly wars. She could not risk losing. Abroad, her rule created complications. In the West, the absence of a male Roman emperor was seen as a political opportunity. When Charlemagne was crowned emperor in the year 800, Western leaders argued that the Roman throne had been effectively vacant. Irene reportedly explored the idea of marrying him, a union that could have reunified East and West under a single ruler. Whether the proposal was serious or merely diplomatic maneuvering, it reveals the extent of her political imagination and desperation. At home, resentment simmered. Many aristocrats never forgave her for blinding her son. Others feared that her reliance on court officials weakened traditional power structures. While no immediate rebellion erupted, support for Irene was thin and conditional. She ruled not through widespread loyalty, but through careful balance and constant vigilance. Irene's reign was quieter than her rise, but no less precarious. She had achieved absolute power, yet it rested on fragile foundations. The empire endured, but it did not thrive. And as years passed, the question that haunted her rule grew louder. How long could a ruler who had destroyed her own dynasty continue to govern an empire built on legitimacy and tradition? By the final years of her reign, the authority of Empress Irene rested on exhaustion rather than loyalty. The empire had not collapsed under her rule, but neither had it prospered. Military setbacks continued. Provincial administration weakened, and resentment toward court favoritism grew sharper. Irene's reliance on eunuchs and bureaucrats insulated her from open rebellion. Yet, it also alienated generals and aristocrats who believed the empire was being quietly mismanaged. The decisive factor was money. Irene's preference for diplomacy over warfare required heavy payments to foreign powers, draining the treasury. Tax burdens increased, angering both urban populations and provincial landowners. In Constantinople, whispers spread that the empire was being governed for the palace rather than the people. Irene's piety no longer compensated for economic strain. In the year 8002, a group of senior officials moved against her. At their center was Niceporos, the logothead of the treasury, a man with administrative experience and strong support among fiscal and military elites. The coup was swift and bloodless. Irene was seized without resistance. There were no riots in her defense, no armies marching to restore her. The silence was telling. Her rule had endured, but it had not inspired devotion. Niceporos was proclaimed emperor, and Irene was formally deposed. Unlike many fallen rulers, she was not executed or mutilated. Her gender, age, and religious reputation protected her from violent retribution. Instead, she was exiled first to the island of princes near Constantinople and later to Lesbos. Stripped of power, wealth, and ceremony, Irene lived out her final days far from the marble halls she had once dominated. In exile, her circumstances were harsh. Accounts suggest she supported herself through simple labor, including spinning wool, a striking contrast to her former imperial life. She died in the year 8003, alone and largely forgotten by the court that had once feared her. Irene's fall was quiet, almost anticlimactic, but it revealed the limits of her achievement. She had broken precedent, ruled alone, and reshaped the religious landscape of the empire. Yet, she had also destroyed her own dynasty and alienated too many pillars of power. When she finally fell, there was no son, no loyal faction, no institution willing to fight for her return. The empire moved on, relieved to restore familiar patterns of rule, even as it quietly absorbed the consequences of her extraordinary reign. The legacy of Empress Irene has never settled into a single verdict. From the moment of her death, she became a figure claimed by opposing narratives, praised as a defender of the faith and condemned as the monster of ambition. Byzantine chroniclers struggled to reconcile her piety with her cruelty, her devotion to the church with the violence she used to secure power. In many ways, Irene embodied the contradictions of the empire she ruled. Religiously, her impact was enduring. The restoration of icons reshaped Byzantine Christianity permanently. The decisions of the Second Council of Nicaea became foundational for Orthodox theology and artistic tradition. Churches once again filled with images of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints, shaping Byzantine visual culture for centuries. In this sense, Irene succeeded where many emperors failed. She imposed a religious settlement that lasted. Later generations of icon supporters remembered her as an instrument of divine will, even comparing her to saintly rulers despite her actions. Politically, her reign was far more troubling. Irene demonstrated that imperial power could be seized and held without military glory or dynastic continuity. She ruled through court politics, religious legitimacy, and personal authority rather than conquest. This set a dangerous precedent. By blinding her son and eliminating the ruling line, she weakened the principle of hereditary succession that had stabilized the empire. The chaos that followed her fall reflected this damage. Her gender has always shaped how history judged her. Male emperors who mutilated rivals, ordered executions, or overthrew family members were condemned, but rarely defined by those acts alone. Irene, by contrast, became inseparable from the image of a mother destroying her child. Whether this judgment reflects moral outrage or discomfort with female power remains debated. What is certain is that her actions crossed boundaries that Byzantine society found difficult to forgive. In Western Europe, her rule had unintended consequences. The crowning of Charlemagne as emperor relied partly on the argument that the Roman throne was vacant under female rule. This act permanently divided imperial authority between East and West. Irene did not cause the split alone, but her reign accelerated it. Today, Irene stands as one of the most complex figures in Byzantine history. She was neither a simple villain nor a misunderstood heroine. She was a ruler who believed that authority justified cruelty, that faith justified force, and that the empire mattered more than blood. Her life remains a warning and a testament. Power can be seized by skill and conviction, but it is rarely held without cost. Before the ancient world learned to write, it learned to listen. Long before tablets, papyrus, or inscriptions. Sound was already shaping human behavior. Rhythm and tone existed as tools of survival, memory, and belief. Early music did not begin as art for pleasure. It began as structure, a way to mark time, coordinate movement, and communicate meaning when spoken language was still fragile and limited. In prehistoric and early ancient societies, music emerged directly from the body and the environment. Hands clapped, feet stamped, stones struck together, hollow logs echoed. These sounds created patterns, and patterns created predictability. Predictability brought comfort and control in an uncertain world. Music helped communities move together, work together, and remember together. A repeated rhythm could guide a hunt, a harvest, or a ritual long before instructions could be spoken or recorded. As societies became more complex, music became inseparable from ritual. Sound was believed to bridge the human and the divine. Drums summoned spirits. Chants honored ancestors. Simple melodies were repeated until they became sacred. Music did not accompany ritual, it was ritual. The act of producing sound in a shared space reinforced social bonds and reinforced belief. To participate in music was to participate in the order of the world. Music also functioned as memory. In cultures without writing, history was sung. Genealogies, myths, laws, and moral lessons were preserved through melody and repetition. A tune made information harder to forget and easier to transmit. Elders taught the young not by reading, but by singing. What survived across generations was not written knowledge, but remembered sound. Even early warfare relied on music. Rhythms coordinated marching. Horns and drums signaled commands. Sound carried authority across distance where words failed. To hear a familiar rhythm was to know where you belonged, who led you, and when to act. Music organized chaos. Crucially, early music was communal. There were no audiences, no performers separate from listeners. Everyone participated. Music belonged to the group, not the individual. Its power came from repetition and shared experience, not originality. By the time ancient civilizations emerged, music was already deeply embedded in human life. Instruments would grow more complex, theories would develop, sacred rules would form, but the foundation remained the same. Music began as a human response to silence, uncertainty, and time itself. Before writing shaped civilization, sound did. As the first cities rose in Mesopotamia, music began to take on clearer form. In the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, sound moved from instinct to craft. This was not merely the birth of instruments, but the beginning of intentional musical culture. Music now had makers, players, and specific purposes tied to temples, courts, and labor. Archaeology gives us some of the earliest physical evidence of music in human history from this region. Lyres, harps, and flutes made of wood, reed, shell, and precious metals have been uncovered in royal tombs. These were not crude objects, they were carefully designed, decorated, and tuned. The famous lyres from the royal cemetery suggest that music already held prestige. Instruments were buried alongside rulers and elites, implying that music accompanied them into the afterlife. In Mesopotamia, music was closely linked to religion. Temples employed musicians as part of their permanent staff. Hymns were composed to honor gods, appease divine anger, and mark festivals. These songs followed strict forms repeated over generations. Music was not improvisation, it was regulated, learned, and respected. Certain melodies were believed to possess power capable of influencing the mood of the gods themselves. For the first time, we also see early attempts to record music. Clay tablets describe tuning systems, intervals, and even fragments of songs. While we cannot reconstruct these melodies with certainty, their existence shows that music was now something worth preserving in writing. Sound was no longer entirely ephemeral. It could be studied, categorized, and transmitted with intention. Music also entered the political sphere. Kings used musicians in ceremonies to reinforce authority and divine favor. Court music distinguished the elite from common people, creating a sonic hierarchy. Public celebrations echoed with drums and strings, reminding listeners of who ruled and who was ruled. Music became part of power. At the same time, music remained woven into daily life. Workers sang while building canals or harvesting crops. Lullabies soothed children. Songs accompanied weddings and funerals. Music marked every transition of life from birth to death. In Mesopotamia, music crossed a critical threshold. It was no longer only communal sound. It became a profession, a ritual science, and a political tool. Civilization did not silence music. It refined it, shaped it, and gave it lasting form. In ancient Egypt, music was not simply heard. It was believed to shape the balance of the universe. Egyptian culture was built around the concept of Mart, the divine order that held the cosmos together. Music was one of the forces that sustained it. Sound, rhythm, and repetition were thought to calm chaos and please the gods, making music a sacred responsibility rather than a personal expression. Music permeated Egyptian religious life. Temples echoed daily with chants, hymns, and instrumental performances offered to the gods. Priests and priestesses were trained musicians, performing according to strict ritual rules. Certain instruments were reserved for sacred contexts, and certain melodies were believed to carry spiritual power. To play music incorrectly was not a harmless mistake. It risked disrupting divine harmony. One of the most important instruments was the serum, a rattle associated with the goddess Hathor. Its sound was believed to drive away evil forces and restore joy and fertility. Harps, flutes, and lyres were also common, often depicted in temple reliefs and tomb paintings. These images are not decorative fantasy. They are records of real musical practice showing posture, hand position, and ensemble arrangement. Music followed Egyptians beyond the temple. In narrow rituals, it guided the dead into the afterlife. Tomb scenes frequently show musicians performing for banquets meant to be enjoyed eternally. Music ensured continuity. Just as the body was preserved through mummification, sound was preserved through ritual repetition. What was played in life would be played again in eternity. Unlike Mesopotamia, Egyptian music was rarely written down in technical detail. Knowledge passed through apprenticeship and tradition. This made music deeply conservative. Melodies changed slowly, guarded by religious authority. Innovation was less valued than correctness. Music's role was not to surprise, but to maintain stability. Music also reflected social hierarchy. Elite households employed professional musicians while common people relied on communal singing and simple instruments. Yet even the poorest Egyptians encountered music regularly. Work songs, festival dances, and street performances filled daily life with sound. Music marked time, seasons, and labor just as reliably as the Nile's floods. In Egypt, music was inseparable from belief. It did not exist to entertain an audience. It existed to uphold the universe. To make music was to participate in cosmic maintenance, a duty shared between gods and humans. As ancient states grew larger and more militarized, music became a weapon of organization and intimidation. Across the ancient world, sound was used to control movement, signal authority, and project power far beyond the reach of the human voice. Music did not merely accompany war, it structured it. In early armies, rhythm was essential. Drums regulated marching pace, keeping soldiers moving as a single body rather than a chaotic mass. A unified rhythm reduced exhaustion and panic, especially during long advances. When hundreds or thousands of feet struck the ground in time with the drum, individual fear was absorbed into collective motion. Music created discipline where none might naturally exist. Horns and trumpets served as instruments of command. Their sharp, penetrating tones carried over battlefield noise, signaling advance, retreat, or regrouping. Different calls conveyed different orders, understood instantly by trained soldiers. In an era without radios or written commands, sound was the fastest and most reliable form of communication. A single blast could shift the fate of a battle. Music also functioned psychologically. The noise of war music was meant to intimidate enemies before combat even began. Loud drums, clashing cymbals, and piercing horns amplified the presence of an army, making it seem larger and more fearsome. To hear an approaching force was often more terrifying than to see it. Sound announced violence in advance. Rulers quickly recognized this power. Military music became part of state identity. Certain rhythms, instruments, and signals were associated with specific armies or kings. To hear them was to know who was coming. Music reinforced loyalty, binding soldiers to a shared sonic language that separated them from civilians and enemies alike. Beyond the battlefield, music reinforced authority through ceremony. Triumphs, parades, and public rituals relied on controlled sound to elevate rulers above the crowd. Drums and trumpets marked the presence of power, creating awe and distance. Silence followed authority, not the other way around. Yet, music in war was not purely functional. It also helped soldiers endure. Songs shared around campfires preserved morale and identity. They reminded fighters of home, comradeship, and purpose. Music humanized war even as it organized it. Across civilizations, the use of music in conflict reveals a harsh truth. Sound could unify, intimidate, and command in ways violence alone could not. Music was not separate from power. It was one of its most effective tools. In ancient China, music was never understood as mere sound or personal expression. It was a force tied directly to moral order, political stability, and the harmony of the universe. To the ancient Chinese mind, a society that produced correct music was a society in balance. When music decayed, so did the state. Some of the earliest musical evidence in China comes from bone flutes discovered at Jiahu, dating back thousands of years. Made from crane bones and carefully drilled with finger holes, these flutes show deliberate tuning and scale awareness. This was not accidental noise. It was structured sound designed to produce specific pitches. Even at this early stage, music was already being shaped by intention and theory. As Chinese civilization developed, music became inseparable from philosophy and governance. Court music was regulated by the state, with specific modes assigned to rituals, seasons, and ceremonies. Each pitch was believed to correspond to cosmic elements, directions, and social roles. Playing the wrong music at the wrong time was not just inappropriate, it was dangerous. Disorder in sound was believed to invite disorder in society. Music played a central role in ritual. Ancestral ceremonies, royal sacrifices, and seasonal rites all required precise musical performance. Large orchestras of bells, chimes, zithers, flutes, and drums were assembled for these occasions. Bronze bells were cast in sets, each producing two distinct tones depending on how they were struck. This technological sophistication reflected the importance placed on musical accuracy. Unlike in many other ancient cultures, music in China was deeply moralized. Philosophers argued that proper music cultivated virtue, while corrupt music encouraged excess and rebellion. Rulers were judged not only by laws and armies, but by the music they promoted. A harmonious state sounded harmonious. Music education was therefore political education. Elite youths learned music as part of their training, not to entertain, but to discipline the mind and emotions. Rhythm taught restraint, melody taught balance. Music shaped character. Outside the court, common people sang work songs, folk melodies, and festival music. But even these were viewed through a moral lens. Folk music was often collected and evaluated by officials as a measure of public sentiment. If songs became bitter or chaotic, it signaled unrest. In ancient China, music was a mirror of society. It reflected order, hierarchy, and cosmic balance. To govern sound correctly was to govern people correctly. In ancient Greece, music crossed a critical boundary. It was no longer only ritual, tradition, or moral force, it became a subject of analysis. Greeks believed music could be understood, measured, and explained through reason. Sound was not just heard, it was studied. Greek music was built on the idea that harmony reflected order in the universe. Philosophers argued that musical intervals followed mathematical ratios, linking sound to cosmic structure. This idea transformed music into a bridge between art and science. To understand music was to understand how the world itself was arranged. The famous concept of the harmony of the spheres imagined celestial bodies moving according to musical ratios, producing an eternal inaudible music that governed existence. Music education was central to Greek life. Young citizens were trained in both music and gymnastics, balancing mind and body. To play the lyre or sing was not a luxury, it was a civic duty. Music shaped character, discipline, and emotional control. Certain modes were believed to inspire courage, others restraint, others sorrow. Choosing the wrong music for the wrong audience could corrupt morals. Music accompanied nearly every public activity. It was present in religious festivals, athletic competitions, theater, and symposia. Tragedies and comedies were not spoken alone. They were sung and accompanied by instruments. The chorus moved and sang in unison, guiding audience emotion and reinforcing communal identity. Music carried meaning beyond words. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, Greek music was rarely preserved in full notation. What survives instead are theories, descriptions, and debates. Philosophers argued fiercely about music's proper role. Some feared that overly complex or emotional music weakened discipline and encouraged excess. Others celebrated innovation. These debates reveal how seriously music was taken. It was seen as powerful enough to shape society for better or worse. Music was also linked to the divine. Gods were associated with instruments and musical styles. Apollo represented order, reason, and the lyre. Dionysus represented ecstasy, rhythm, and release. Greek culture lived in tension between these two musical ideals, between control and abandon. Through Greece, music became intellectualized. It was no longer just inherited tradition, it was theory, ethics, and education. Sound had entered philosophy, and once it did, it would never leave. In ancient Rome, music lost much of the philosophical weight it carried in Greece and gained something else instead: scale. Roman music was loud, public, and inseparable from spectacle. Where Greeks debated the moral effects of melody, Romans cared about impact. Music was meant to be heard by crowds, to command attention, and to amplify power. Roman culture absorbed musical traditions from across its empire. Greek theory, Etruscan ritual sounds, Near Eastern instruments, and local folk music all blended into a practical performance-driven tradition. Rome did not seek musical purity. It sought effectiveness. If an instrument could fill an arena or energize a procession, it had value. Public life in Rome was saturated with sound. Triumphs echoed with trumpets and horns. Religious festivals featured choirs and percussion. The theater relied on musical accompaniment to heighten emotion and guide audience response. Even gladiatorial games were choreographed with sound. Music signaled entrances, climaxes, and death. The arena was not silent violence. It was a controlled sensory experience. Military music remained crucial. Roman legions marched to rhythm and commands were transmitted through horns and trumpets. Each signal was standardized and instantly recognizable. Discipline was reinforced through sound. A soldier learned to obey tones as instinctively as orders. Music created unity across vast multilingual armies. Unlike Greece, Rome placed little emphasis on musical education for elites. Playing instruments was often associated with entertainers, slaves, or professionals rather than aristocrats. Embers who performed publicly risked ridicule even as they relied heavily on music to project authority. This tension reveals Rome's pragmatic relationship with sound. Music was powerful, but not prestigious. Religion still mattered, but ritual precision mattered less than effect. Music marked sacrifices and ceremonies, yet innovation and volume often outweighed tradition. Roman music adapted easily, evolving with changing tastes and influences. It was flexible, portable, and suited to empire. In private life, Music accompanied banquets, drinking parties, and domestic leisure. Flutes, strings, and singers filled wealthy homes. Music softened excess and elevated pleasure. It was entertainment, not moral instruction. Rome transformed ancient music into a tool of mass experience. It unified crowds, energized soldiers, and magnified authority. Music no longer upheld cosmic balance or philosophical order. It upheld empire. Beyond the Mediterranean world, ancient civilizations developed musical traditions just as complex, but shaped by very different beliefs. In ancient India, music was understood as sacred vibration. Sound was not merely heard, it was believed to shape reality itself. The universe, according to Indian philosophy, was created through sound, and music was a way to align human life with cosmic truth. The earliest Indian musical traditions are closely tied to the Vedas, ancient sacred texts transmitted orally for centuries. These texts were not read, they were chanted with extreme precision. Pitch, rhythm, and breath were essential. A single mistake in sound was believed to weaken the power of the words. Music here was preservation. It ensured that sacred knowledge survived unchanged across generations without writing. From this tradition emerged the concept of raga not as a fixed melody, but as a structured emotional framework. Each raga was associated with a mood, a time of day, a season, or a spiritual state. Music was meant to transform the listener internally, guiding emotion and awareness. Playing the wrong raga at the wrong time disrupted harmony, not just aesthetically, but spiritually. Music in ancient India was inseparable from ritual, meditation, and devotion. Instruments, such as early string zithers, flutes, and drums accompanied chanting and storytelling. Music guided prayer, focused the mind, and disciplined emotion. Like in China, sound was moralized, but here it was also transcendent. Music was a path toward liberation. Far from Asia, ancient cultures in the Americas developed musical traditions rooted in community and cosmology. Drums, flutes, and whistles accompanied ceremonies tied to agriculture, weather, and ancestry. Music called rain honored the dead and reinforced collective identity. There was little separation between musician and participant. Sound belonged to the group. Across these civilizations, a shared belief emerges. Music was not decoration, it was force. It could preserve knowledge, regulate emotion, connect humans to gods, and align society with unseen powers. Though instruments and styles differed, the assumption remained the same. Sound mattered because it shaped reality. By the end of the ancient world, music had taken many forms, but its purpose remained profound. Whether guiding ritual, preserving sacred words, or transforming inner states, music was understood as something far greater than entertainment. It was a language older than writing, capable of reaching where words could not. By the end of antiquity, music had become one of humanity's most enduring inheritances. Ancient civilizations vanished, languages shifted, temples collapsed, and empires fractured. Yet their music left traces that never fully disappeared. Not in exact melodies, which were rarely written down, but in ideas about what music is for and why it matters. The ancient world established music as more than sound. It defined it as memory, ritual, power, morality, and structure. Later civilizations did not invent these concepts, they inherited them. Medieval chant, sacred hymnody, court music, and even modern theories of harmony all rest on ancient foundations. The belief that music can shape emotion, discipline society, or connect humans to something beyond themselves did not emerge later. It was already ancient. One of the most important legacies was the idea that music carries authority in temples, courts, and armies. Sound organized people before laws or texts could. This idea survived into religious institutions where chant still regulates worship and into states where national anthems and ceremonial music reinforce identity. The ancient assumption remains intact: music unifies faster than words. Another lasting inheritance was the link between music and morality. From China to Greece, Thinkers believed that sound influenced character. Even today, debates about music's effect on behavior echo these ancient concerns. The fear that music can corrupt or elevate did not begin in modern times. It is as old as civilization itself. Ancient cultures also left behind the idea that music belongs to time. Certain sounds for certain moments, certain rhythms for work, war, worship, or mourning. This concept still governs how humans use music instinctively. Lullabies, funeral music, celebratory songs, and marching rhythms are ancient patterns repeated endlessly with new instruments and styles. Perhaps the most striking legacy is that music survived without writing. While laws, histories, and beliefs often required text to endure, music persisted through bodies and breath. It adapted, it transformed, it refused to vanish. This resilience suggests something fundamental. Music answers a need deeper than literacy or politics. The ancient world did not see music as background noise, it treated sound as meaningful action. To make music was to do something consequential, to listen was to participate. Though the civilizations that shaped early music are gone, their assumptions remain alive. Every time music marks a ritual, disciplines emotion, or binds a group together, the ancient world speaks again. Sound once used to shape gods, kings, and empires continues to shape us. In the ancient world, curses were not superstition or folklore, they were a form of action. When legal systems failed, when social rank limited retaliation, or when direct confrontation was impossible, people turned to magic as a practical solution. A curse was a weapon for the powerless, a way to act when no other options remained. Unlike public religion, which relied on shared rituals and communal approval, curses were private and secretive. They were meant to operate in silence away from witnesses and social consequences. A person did not need strength, status, or allies to curse an enemy. They needed belief, precision, and the correct ritual steps. This made cursing especially attractive to those on the margins of society. Slaves, women, foreigners, rejected lovers, ruined merchants, and defeated rivals. Curses were rarely abstract, they were specific, personal, and brutally focused. Names were written clearly so there could be no confusion. Spell writers targeted bodies, minds, voices, careers, fertility, memory, or luck. A rival might be cursed to lose court cases, forget arguments, stumble in business, or suffer insomnia and weakness. The goal was not symbolic suffering, it was real, observable harm. One of the most common tools was the curse tablet, often made of lead. Lead was cold, heavy, and associated with death and the underworld. The tablet was inscribed with words of binding and command, folded tightly, sometimes pierced with nails, and then buried. Placement mattered. Graves, wells, crossroads, and temples connected to underworld gods were favored locations. The earth itself was believed to deliver the message. These curses were not addressed to abstract forces. They were petitions to gods of the dead, restless spirits, or divine enforcers believed to operate below the surface of the world. The curse did not rely on chance, it relied on obligation. By naming the target and invoking divine authority, the cursor believed they were compelling action. Cursing was not always motivated by hatred. Love magic was just as common and often more disturbing. People attempted to bind lovers, break marriages, ignite obsession, or cause rivals to be rejected. Desire was treated as something controllable through force. The emotional tone of these spells is often desperate, revealing fear of abandonment and loss. In the ancient world, curses filled the space between justice and revenge. They were dangerous, hidden, and taken seriously. To curse was to act even when everything else was denied. In ancient Greece, curses were refined into a highly structured practice known as binding magic. These spells were called defictionis from a word meaning to fasten down or immobilize. The purpose was clear. A binding spell was meant to restrict a person's ability to act, speak, think, or succeed. Rather than asking for dramatic destruction, most Greek curses aimed for subtle but devastating interference. Binding spells were deeply practical. They targeted real problems faced by ordinary people. Lawsuits were one of the most common triggers. A litigant might curse an opponent's tongue so they would forget their arguments or stumble while speaking in court. Athletes were cursed before competitions so their limbs would weaken or their focus collapse. Merchants cursed rivals to ruin negotiations or cause customers to turn away. These spells reveal how competitive and anxious Greek society could be. The structure of Greek curses was formulaic and deliberate. The victim's name was written repeatedly, sometimes alongside their mother's name to ensure precision. The spell would list specific body parts or abilities to be bound. Hands, feet, voice, mind, memory, and breath were frequent targets. The language was commanding, not pleading. The writer did not ask the gods politely, they instructed them. Greek binding spells often invoked underworld powers, such as Hermes in his chthonic aspect, Persephone, Hecate, or unnamed spirits of the dead. These entities were believed to move freely between worlds and enforce restrictions on the living. The cursed tablet served as a contract delivered physically into their domain through burial. Placement was crucial. Many defictions were deposited in graves, especially those of people who had died violently or prematurely. Such spirits were thought to be restless and eager to act. Wells and springs were also favored as they were seen as gateways to the underworld. Once placed, the curse was considered active and irreversible unless counter magic was performed. Love magic formed a darker subset of binding spells. These curses aimed to bind not actions but desire. The target might be cursed to feel unbearable longing, sleeplessness, or obsession until they submitted. The language in these spells is often intense and violent, revealing an understanding of love as domination rather than mutual feeling. Greek binding magic shows a world where supernatural force was treated as a legal and emotional extension of everyday life. When persuasion failed, magic restrained. When justice stalled, curses acted. In this way, binding spells became an invisible but persistent presence beneath Greek society. In ancient Rome, cursing became widespread, standardized, and astonishingly personal. The Romans inherited binding magic from the Greek world, but they expanded it into nearly every corner of daily life. Curse tablets appear across the empire, scratched into lead by people from all social classes, from slaves and freedmen to soldiers and merchants. Magic was not marginal, it was embedded in Roman reality. Roman curse tablets often read like legal documents. The language is formal, repetitive, and obsessively detailed. Spell writers named their enemies precisely, listed grievances, and demanded specific punishments. A thief might be cursed to lose sleep, strength, and health until stolen property was returned. A rival might be cursed to lose favor with patrons, or suffer financial collapse. The curse acted as a supernatural lawsuit filed when the human courts were too slow, corrupt, or inaccessible. Many Roman curses targeted thieves, especially those who stole from baths, markets, or temples. Victims of theft frequently dedicated curses to local gods, asking them to identify and punish the guilty party. These curses often promised offerings in exchange for divine enforcement, turning the spell into a transaction. The god was expected to act because they had been formally invoked and compensated. Like Greek depiction, Roman curse tablets were buried in places associated with supernatural access. Graves remained popular, especially mass graves or burial sites of the young and violently dead. Wells, rivers, and sacred springs were also common. In Britain, dozens of curse tablets were thrown into watery shrines, asking local deities to exact justice. Once deposited, the curse was believed to be active indefinitely. Roman love magic was equally aggressive. These spells aimed to inflame a desire, cause obsession, or destroy rival relationships. Targets were cursed to experience restlessness, madness, and physical discomfort until they submitted to the cursor's will. Many of these tablets use violent imagery, comparing desire to burning, binding, or choking. Love was treated as something to be forced through suffering. What makes Roman curse tablets especially revealing is their emotional rawness. Unlike official inscriptions or literature, these spells were private. They preserve anger, jealousy, humiliation, and desperation without restraint. The writers believed the gods were listening and they spoke honestly. In Roman society, magic did not replace law or religion, it operated alongside them. When formal systems failed to protect personal interests, curses filled the gap. They offered action without confrontation and justice without witnesses. For many Romans, this made magic not irrational, but necessary. In ancient Egypt, curses were inseparable from death, the afterlife, and cosmic balance. Egyptian magic was not primarily about sudden revenge or emotional release. It was about permanence. A curse in Egypt was meant to endure beyond a single lifetime, following its victim into eternity. Egyptians believed that words, when spoken or written correctly, possess creative force. Just as sacred texts sustained the gods and the cosmos, hostile words could dismantle a person's spiritual integrity. This made cursing an act of profound seriousness. A curse did not merely cause misfortune, it threatened the soul itself. One of the most feared forms of Egyptian curse magic involved the dead. Tombs were sacred spaces, but they were also dangerous. Spells were written to protect graves from intruders, warning of blindness, illness, or divine punishment for those who disturbed the dead. These were not symbolic warnings. They were believed to activate automatically, enforced by gods, demons, or the restless spirits of the deceased. Curses could also be woven into rituals. Figurines known as execration figures were inscribed with the names of enemies, then smashed, buried, or burned. The destruction of the object symbolized the destruction of the person. By breaking the name, the cursor believed they were breaking the individual's power and future. Since identity was bound to name in Egyptian belief, this was a direct spiritual attack. Another method involved ritual texts designed to erase someone from the afterlife. To be denied remembrance was the ultimate punishment. A person who could not be named, spoken of, or recognized by the gods risked annihilation. Some curses asked not for pain, but for forgetting. Eternal silence was worse than death. Blood, hair, and personal items were sometimes used to strengthen these spells. Physical connection anchored the curse to its target. The closer the link, the more inescapable the magic. These practices reveal how deeply Egyptians believed the material and spiritual worlds overlapped. Unlike Greek and Roman curses, Egyptian magic was tightly controlled by religious authority. Priests acted as ritual specialists and magical knowledge was guarded. This did not make it gentler. It made it more absolute. When curses were sanctioned, they carried divine legitimacy. In Egypt, to curse was to rewrite destiny. Harm did not end at death. It continued forever, echoing through the judgment of the soul and the silence of the tomb. In Mesopotamia, curses were understood as part of a crowded supernatural ecosystem filled with gods, demons, ghosts, and hostile forces that constantly interfered in human life. Unlike Greek or Roman curse magic, which focused on binding rivals, Mesopotamian magic was often defensive. The world itself was dangerous, and misfortune was assumed to have a supernatural cause. Illness, madness, infertility, nightmares, and sudden death were frequently blamed on curses sent by enemies or inflicted by malevolent beings. These curses might be intentional, cast by a jealous rival, or accidental, triggered by offending a god or disturbing a restless spirit. The result was the same. Harm had entered the body or household and had to be removed. Mesopotamian texts describe a wide range of curse-bearing entities. Demons such as Lamashtu and Pazuzu were blamed for attacking mothers and children. Ghosts of the improperly buried dead were believed to linger, spreading sickness and fear. Even gods could curse humans who failed in ritual duty. Life was lived under constant supernatural pressure. Because of this, counter magic was just as important as harmful magic. Exorcists and ritual specialists performed elaborate ceremonies to identify, neutralize, and reverse curses. These rituals involved spoken incantations, symbolic actions, and physical objects meant to trap or expel the curse. Clay figurines representing demons or enemies were bound, burned, or buried to contain the threat. Language was central. Incantations followed strict formulas passed down for centuries. The words themselves were believed to force supernatural compliance. A curse could be undone only by stronger words spoken correctly and with authority. Mistakes were dangerous. Incorrect ritual could worsen the affliction. Unlike later cursed traditions, Mesopotamian magic rarely focused on personal revenge alone. The concern was survival. The cursed person might not know who targeted them, only that something was wrong. Magic was diagnostic as much as aggressive. It sought to identify which god, ghost, or enemy was responsible and restore balance. Objects were heavily used. Amulets, seals, and inscribed tablets were worn or placed in homes to block curses. Some contained threats against demons, warning them of divine punishment if they approached. Others invoked protective gods to stand guard day and night. In Mesopotamia, curses revealed a worldview shaped by fear and uncertainty. Harm did not require intent. The universe itself was unstable. Magic was not fringe belief, it was emergency maintenance. To curse, counter-curse, and protect was simply part of staying alive in a world where unseen forces were always watching. Across the ancient world, love was rarely treated as mutual affection. It was seen as a force that could be ignited, redirected, or violently imposed through supernatural means. When desire failed, magic intervened. These spells were not gentle charms meant to inspire romance. They were acts of domination. The goal was not love, but control. Targets were cursed to feel overwhelming longing, sleeplessness, anxiety, and physical discomfort until they submitted to the cursor's will. Many spells explicitly asked that the victim be unable to eat, drink, rest, or think clearly unless united with the spell's author. Erotic curses appear frequently in the Greek and Roman worlds, especially on lead tablets buried in graves or wells. The underworld was considered the ideal enforcer of passion as desire was linked to loss of control and suffering. Gods and spirits associated with death were invoked to twist the mind and body of the target. Love in this context was treated as a kind of illness to be inflicted. The language of these spells is often violent and unsettling. Targets are described as burning, choking, or being torn apart internally by desire. Some spells demand that the victim abandon family, reputation, or existing relationships. Rivals were cursed simultaneously, ensuring rejection, impotence, or separation. Love magic was competitive and ruthless. Women were frequent targets, but also frequent users. Erotic curses offered agency in societies where women had limited control over marriage and desire. Through magic, a woman could bypass social barriers, force attraction, or punish rejection. Men, especially those of lower status, also turned to these spells when wealth or rank failed to secure affection. Physical materials intensified these curses. Hair, nail clippings, clothing threads, and bodily fluids were used to anchor the spell to the victim. Figurines representing the target were sometimes bound, pierced, or melted, symbolizing enforced submission. The closer the physical connection, the stronger the spell was believed to be. Erotic curses reveal a darker truth about ancient emotional life. Desire was feared because it destabilized reason and order. Rather than surrendering to uncertainty, people tried to command it. Magic offered certainty through suffering. In these spells, love was not sacred or romantic, it was coercive. The ancient world understood passion as something dangerous, powerful, and exploitable. Erotic curses did not celebrate love, they weaponized it, turning longing into a tool of control and revenge. As curses became more widespread, ancient societies grew uneasy about their power. Magic was useful, but it was also dangerous. By the late classical period, many states began to treat cursium as a threat to public order. The same spells that promised private justice could destabilize communities if left unchecked. In ancient Rome, laws against harmful magic existed alongside the continued practice of cursing. This contradiction reveals the tension at the heart of ancient belief. People feared magic even as they relied on it. Officially, curse magic was condemned when it targeted the state, the emperor, or public stability. Unofficially, it remained tolerated when it stayed personal, hidden, and deniable. Accusations of sorcery were serious. To be labeled a magician was to be associated with secrecy, foreign influence, and subversion. Trials for magic often emerged during political crisis when fear of conspiracy ran high. Curses were invisible by nature, which made them perfect scapegoats. A sudden illness, a failed campaign, or an unexpected death could be blamed on hidden spells rather than human failure. Public anxiety intensified because curses bypassed social norms. They allowed slaves to harm masters, women to control men, and rivals to act without confrontation. This inversion of hierarchy made elites especially nervous. Magic did not respect rank. Anyone with the right knowledge could wield it. Despite legal restrictions, evidence shows that cursing continued openly in certain spaces. In provincial shrines, especially in Roman Britain, hundreds of cursed tablets were deposited publicly, asking local gods to punish thieves or liars. These were not hidden acts of rebellion. They were socially accepted appeals for justice when authorities failed. The gods were treated as judges and curses as legal petitions. This dual attitude produced hypocrisy. The same officials who condemn magic might secretly consult astrologers or commission curses. Emperors themselves were rumored to fear spells and counter spells. Protective amulets, purification rituals, and counter curses circulated at every level of society. Fear of curses also shaped religion. Protective prayers, exorcisms, and blessings grew more elaborate as defensive responses to unseen threats. Communities sought safety through ritual purity and divine favor, hoping to block malicious magic before it struck by treating curses as both forbidden and necessary. Ancient societies revealed their deepest anxiety. They believed words could kill, names could bind, and intent could cross distance invisibly. Magic was feared not because it was unreal, but because too many people believed it worked. For centuries, ancient curses were dismissed as literary exaggeration or superstition. That changed when archaeology began uncovering the physical evidence. Buried beneath temples, tossed into wells, hidden in graves, and sealed in sanctuaries, cursed tablets emerged by the thousands. These were not symbolic relics. They were real objects created by real people who expected real results. Most cursed tablets were made of lead, a material chosen deliberately. Lead was associated with heaviness, coldness, and death. It bent easily, allowing tablets to be folded, twisted, or pierced with nails. These physical acts mattered. Folding bound the victim, piercing immobilized them. The tablet itself became a proxy body, absorbing the violence meant for its target. Archaeologists have recovered cursed tablets from across the Mediterranean world, including Greece, Italy, North Africa, and Roman Britain. Many were discovered in wells and springs, places believed to connect the surface world with the underworld. Water carried messages downward. Once submerged, a curse was considered delivered. Graves were another favored location, especially those of the young, the violently dead, or the socially marginal. Such spirits were believed to be restless and easier to enlist. By placing a cursed tablet alongside a corpse, the cursor was effectively hiring the dead as an enforcer. Some tablets even instruct the spirit directly, naming it as an active participant. What makes these discoveries so unsettling is their intimacy. The language is personal, emotional, and often desperate. Unlike official inscriptions, curse tablets preserve raw human anxiety. They name lovers, rivals, neighbors, and thieves. They reveal failed relationships, stolen property, courtroom fears, and wounded pride. Ancient magic was not abstract belief, it was lived experience. Some tablets include drawings of bound figures, twisted limbs, or symbols meant to confuse the victim's mind. Others contain nonsense words believed to be the secret names of spirits or the language of the gods. Precision mattered. A poorly written curse might fail or rebound onto its author. In many cases, archaeologists have found tablets still folded, pierced, and sealed exactly as they were left centuries ago. No one retrieved them, no one checked results. The act of burial completed the spell. These discoveries leave little room for doubt. Ancient people invested time, resources, and risk into curse magic. They believed words could cross worlds, that harm could be delivered without touch, and that justice could be enforced invisibly. Buried in silence, these tablets waited, not for forgiveness, but for results. Ancient curses were not fringe behavior practiced by the desperate few. They mattered because people believed the world listened. Words, names, and intentions were thought to move through unseen channels carried by gods, spirits, and the dead. In a universe where fate felt unstable and justice unreliable, curses offered a way to intervene. What made curse magic powerful was not spectacle, but belief in process. A curse required correct materials, precise language, and proper placement. Each step transformed emotion into action. Anger became inscription. Fear became ritual. Desire became command. The act of cursing restored a sense of agency to people who otherwise had none. Curses also reveal how ancient societies understood responsibility. Misfortune rarely occurred without cause. Illness, failure, and loss were often interpreted as the result of hidden hostility. Someone somewhere had acted. This worldview created constant vigilance. Protection mattered as much as attack. Amulets, prayers, counter spells, and purification rituals flourished because harm was assumed to be intentional. Importantly, curses were rarely random, they followed social fault lines. Lawsuits, love triangles, theft, competition, and envy generated magic because they generated helplessness. When power imbalances prevented open retaliation, curses leveled the field. A slave could strike a master, a rejected lover could dominate a rival. Magic inverted hierarchy. The moral ambiguity of curses was widely accepted. They were feared, but not universally condemned. The same societies that punished public magic tolerated private cursing. The difference was visibility. What threatened order was not magic itself, but magic that challenged authority openly. Hidden curses remained manageable. Over time, the rise of new religions and legal systems reframed curse magic as sinful, dangerous, or delusional. Yet, the impulse never disappeared. The belief that words can wound, that intent can harm, and that unseen forces can be persuaded persists across cultures and centuries. Modern superstitions, whispered wishes of harm, and symbolic acts of release echo ancient practices. Ancient curses endure not because they worked in a literal sense, but because they answered real psychological needs. They transformed fear into action and helplessness into purpose. They allowed people to feel heard by a universe that otherwise felt indifferent. Buried in lead and silence, ancient curses tell a simple truth. When justice feels distant and power feels unreachable, humans will always search for ways to make the world listen.